If the kid's doing well, the teacher's doing well, the parents are happy, the principal's happy. Depending on the size of the board or district, if the principals, the students, the parents are happy, the superintendent, the executive superintendent, the director's happy, then the ministry's happy because the community's doing well. So I think what I did differently was everybody else focused at it from a ministry level or a CEO level, and then working its way down to teaching and then learning. And I started with the learning.
I think over the years, I've learned that leadership definitely has lots of similarities, no matter what the profession, no matter what the institution, whether it's sports or business or education. There are lots of similarities and things we can learn from all of those places and all of those people who have been successful in that role. And today's guest is from the business world. Steve Brown is the CEO of Nelson Education, Canada's longest standing education company. And Steve joined forces there a number of years ago to really help transform that company from a very traditional publishing company to one that is definitely embraced the digital world. And so that journey was really fascinating for me to hear and learn about. But I thought also fascinating is that Steve's background has him in the automotive industry. It has him in the service industry, just very different industries, and yet the same principles of leadership apply. And I think that's what I want people to get from this conversation is that what does leadership look like in other places, and what is it that we can learn from that? And again, Steve shares so many great insights and thoughts on leadership in general, and also his true love for education. So I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Steve Brown. Welcome, Steve. Just in the few moments that we started, I'm sorry, my brain just goes to that. You mentioned you worked at a golf club. You piqued my interest. Tell me that story and how that actually spurred you to start your career.
Yeah. First of all, it's great to be here, Dean. Thanks for the opportunity to chat. My backstory is a pretty unusual one when you look at the educational landscape in Canada and the many good friends I've made over the last 7.5 years. But at an early age, I started to work in a golf club, and I worked in the restaurant and I worked behind the bar. And then I ended up actually buying the catering franchise at a very famous golf club. So that was my business in their premises. And after a few months, the guy who ran the clubhouse and the bars downstairs actually left. And the club came to me and said, "You're doing a great job with the restaurants." I trained as a chef. I did my master's in wine. They said, "Would you be interested in also becoming an employee at the same time and taking over?" So I ran the whole golf club with the exception of the golf course itself. And I did that for a number of years. And I was a young guy and I was working. I used to have Wednesdays off, and often my Wednesdays would get interrupted. But a lot of high net worth individuals at the golf club who used to come in regularly. And I figured when you work in 120 hours a week, it must be more fun on the other side of the bar than it was on my side. Not that I wasn't enjoying it, because it was tremendous. And it was actually my first inkling that I actually had a skill from a leadership standpoint. The sort of realization that you make in your early 20s that you might actually be good at motivating people and delivering on objectives. So I did that, and then I went into industry and I worked for a large public company, and I was in the automotive industry. Originally, it was the chemical industry supplying to automotive. And one of my customers wanted to bring me over to the automotive side. So I ran a large public multinational, started off running the UK business in the mid to late 80s, 86, 87. And then I ended up running part of Europe and then all of Europe. And then I got moved to Asia. And then from Korea, I moved to North America. And I ended up being CEO of a global business with 38,000 employees. And part of my learning was being immersed in different cultures, living in Germany, living in France, living in Korea, San Diego, Detroit. And I realized that the real skill was leadership and not really culture. And I think that true leadership can transcend cultures. But certainly those immersive experiences made me a better human being. But it's the business of business if you're focused. And then from there, I moved into the media business. 2008, when the global meltdown happened, I decided I'd leave the automotive business after 20 odd years. And I joined a large Canadian, another public company, 27,000 employees, I think, 32 countries around the world. And I did that and thoroughly enjoyed it. And then eventually that business was sold. The shareholders made a lot of money. So I think that would go down as success. And my plan was to take a couple of years off at that point. And then Nelson came calling. And it was actually not the company, but the shareholders of Nelson who came. And unbeknownst to me, they'd made a lot of money on my last gig. And they played on both sides of the balance sheet, both trading debt, but also on the equities on the stock exchange. So without me knowing, I'd sort of ingratiated myself. And they came to me first in, I think, January 2016 and said, look, we've got this large storied Canadian asset called Nelson Education. And we've got all of the education market knowledge we need, but we need a strategic leader because every other sector in the world is going to go through a lot of change, and we'd like to offer you the position. And I turned them down, and they came back again. I turned them down again. And eventually I acquiesced and said I'd join. So in March of 2016, I said I'd join Nelson, which at that time was 103 years old, the oldest and largest educational materials company in the country. And I know, Dean, you're a Canadian. If you were educated in Canada, you were educated on Nelson materials and Nelson textbooks as they were then. So I came in, I had a lot between when I accepted the position in March and when I joined in June. I literally probably read and studied more about the educational market than I had done in my prior 50 years. And I looked closely at it and I saw something that really stood out to me. And that was the business that Nelson had been in for 100 odd years relevant to new educators and students of today, of that generation? And I decided that textbooks were being dilutive in terms of the relevance, in terms of student engagement with learning materials. So I started a journey, which is today called Edwin, a multidisciplinary platform being used coast to coast in Canada, with approaching 1 million kids today and soon be much higher than that. And a lot of people in our marketplace thought I was crazy. They really did. Who's the new guy? Knows nothing about education. And executive superintendents across the country and directors as then owning part of the country, the CEOs of the boards, whose stewardship takes care of 5 million students. A lot of them were intrigued by what I started. And to be quite frank, a lot of them just wouldn't engage with me because I was from outside the tent. I wasn't from education. But I'm glad to say over the last 7.5 years, that's really changed. And a lot of them are very near and dear friends to me now. So an
Well,
interesting journey, but
But from the leadership perspective, I think what fascinates me is in education, it's unique in the sense that people who are in those highest level leader positions always come through. They were teachers, they were principals, like that is, and I don't know other industries where that's always as true as it is in education.
yeah,
I had an interesting conversation with Steve Gallagher, who is he's the CEO in Halifax, but
yeah, yeah,
it's executive director. I don't know exactly the term. But we talked about the fact that how important is it that you have gone through the ranks? How is important that you were a great teacher? Does being a great teacher translate into being a great leader? And I think we wrestled with that question, but I think the outcome was not necessarily. They are very different skill sets. Like being a CEO and being a classroom teacher, sure, there's similarities. I don't want to
yeah.
discount that, but it isn't the same job. And I think what I would love to know from you, Steve, is from your journey from automotive to media to education, you weren't hired because you're an education expert. That's not why you're where
Right.
you are. But you have a skill set that worked and is effective. And broadly speaking, it's leadership. But I don't wonder if you can distill down and talk a little bit about what things that you did as a leader in the automotive industry and the media industry and now in education that have served you well over the time. What do you carry with you? Obviously, you're learning new things and you're
Yeah.
diving into the content. But again, that's not why you're in the position that you're in. You've developed a skill set that has been successful in multiple industries. What is that skill set?
That's a great question. I think focus plays a huge part. I think the ability to be able to see what will come, not what is. Because if you're too focused on what is right now, you're not focused on the next field. A CEO's job is you're already in a field. You've got people who are going to farm that field. You've got people who are going to plow it and plant and sow and reap and harvest. You've got to be worried about the next field and the next field, and then ensure that your team is capable to be future proof, that they're going to be growing, they're going to be mentored, they're going to be developing for a skill set that's needed when you get there. And that's what's so interesting about education. Everyone talks about 21st century skills. I'm so tired of hearing that descriptor. But we need to enable students of today to be ready for tomorrow. And to do that, you need change. And that's what I think is the biggest thing. Those industry that I was in, both automotive and media, went through massive disruption. And the ability not to get too caught up in the today, but have the fluidity, the agility to be able to react, to be ready for tomorrow, I think is real leadership. And for that, you got to have a strategic view. And the other thing that I think I've carried is the ability to embrace a bit of discomfort. Because in any journey, you're going to go through times that are uncomfortable. But if you can actually embrace that discomfort and be able to turn that round from something that isn't comfortable to something that's an asset, to something that's a learning journey, to something that's a learning moment, then you're becoming better every day. But I think the biggest one is surrounding yourself with a team that's smarter than you. And I've successfully done that. Now, having said that, when you're me, it's not that difficult to surround yourself with smarter people, but I'm always looking to develop people and develop people. I've made lifelong friends out of that. I spoke with one of my ex-colleagues this morning I haven't seen for 30 years. And he brought up a comment. He said he's a leader himself. He's a CEO right now in Europe. And he said, whenever things get tough and whenever it's like there isn't an immediate answer, I always go to one place. And I'm like, really? And yeah, I always say to myself, what would Steve do? And I'm like, Fred, really? You say that? He said, all the time, because when all around you, he said, it's a bit like the old Rudyard Kipling poem, when everyone around you is losing your head, you were the one who'd like take a moment, be a bit reflective. How big's the problem? But I'd always, and I still do that, I distill it down to, look, nobody's going to die. It really is just business. So like, how do we get through this? What can we do? How do you lead? And when you can disseminate that kind of attitude, then you truly become a leader, because you're only a leader when people follow you. You're not a leader because you get a
Exactly right.
CEO job,
Exactly
right?
right. Yeah.
A lot of people get mixed up in that. I'm the big boss. I'm in the big chair. I earn the big bucks. And that's actually dilutive to real leadership. It's when you're in there, when you're able to show empathy and understanding and not come down hard on people who make a mistake. Let's not make it twice. There's no right and wrong. There's just learning. And if you go at it like that, you start to empower and ingratiate yourself, but more importantly, empower the people you work with and for every day.
When you said you're only a leader if people follow you, is I love that, because that's something from Marcus Buckingham's book on the nine lives of work, is that leadership is not a thing, in that you can hear the skills you have to be a good leader, because I can look at one leader and another leader, and they have very different skills. So you're only a leader in terms of who follows you. That's
Right.
that's the only real metric you can use. So I love that. But the thing I wonder about too is, you talked early when you were talking there about disruption.
Yeah.
You talked about we need to make these changes. And again, I'm looking back at the scope of your career in automotive and in media and now in education. Those of us who have been in education for this length of time and are constantly talking, and I know you spend most of your time with leaders who are interested in change or interested in how do
Yeah.
we do things differently and better. That said, education is a behemoth in terms of change. It's slow. And there's lots of reasons for that. One is it's the level of government intervention sometimes slows that down. There's a sector that is still clinging to status quo, right? It's the old adage of parents in particular. I just want to be taught. I want my kids to be taught the way I was taught. That's not
Yeah.
realistic. It's not, you're not getting it, right? So there's all these reasons why. So how do you address that in terms of, is that something like when you were in those other industries and you decided, hey, we need to shift and we need to change and we do it. And what does it take to change in that and those industries versus what it takes to change in education? So what have you noticed about the education sector that says, that's a different kind of challenge than you faced? Or is it the same?
No, I think you touched on it, honestly, Dean. The biggest variable of the three industries that I've been in is the speed of change, the speed of acceptance, the speed of disruption. I think that education is pretty binary. I think I know almost every CEO across the country, and there's been a lot of change, particularly in Ontario in the last year, where about 50% of the CEOs have changed. I would say that there are two types of CEOs right now. Ones who are the settlers, ones who are like, it's not broken, it doesn't need fixing. So mirror the point you made about parents. And then there are other ones who are like open to change because they know that the model's broken. We're not giving kids what we need to. We're not giving teachers what we need, new teachers. And what teachers really need is given some time back. The pressures that teachers feel every day with more and more work they're being given has got little to do with teaching and more to do with dilution in terms of, can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do this report? With some of them, it's been really interesting. I introduced them to Edwin really early on, and some of them grabbed it and ran. Some have been using Edwin for 5 years. We've been growing at over 100% per year since we launched Edwin. So not exactly a slouch in terms of performance, but now we're seeing the neighboring boards influencing them. There's a bit of like FOMO going on, the fear of missing out. What do you mean the board to my left, the board to my right, the board to my south, and the board to my north roll on Edwin, and I'm not? So that's just natural. But there's the change comes from that embracing discomfort. Just because we haven't done it like that before doesn't make it not right. And if we would have gone out to the education marketplace and said, what do you want to change education? It probably would have come back looking pretty much like they've already got. And there was a guy by the name of Steve Jobs when he launched iPhone. He didn't go out to the millions of consumers and say, what do you want your phone to do? Because he would have ended up with a phone that you could talk on. So we went at that, and I was betting the farm because if we got it wrong, we could have destroyed textbooks and had no business. And we're the only Canadian heritage company in the content business making learning materials. So we would have gone away. So it was a big bet, but it was a bet that I focused on the consumer of knowledge, not on the decision maker of how they acquire knowledge. So I didn't focus on the CEOs. I'm like, if I'm a kid today, how do I want to learn? How is every other aspect of my life in terms of search engine, recommendation engine? I see, Dean, you're reading this, you might like this. So I thought if I could get the consumer of knowledge more engaged, think about that as a chain. A student's more engaged, so therefore outcomes go up. We all know that in education. An engaged student does better. So if the classroom's doing better, if each of the 25, 27, 30 kids are doing better, teacher's happy and successful. If the teacher's happy and successful, the parents, that constituent you talked about, the parents are happy because the kids are doing well. All of a sudden, little Johnny's enjoying school, not hating school. If the kid's doing well, the teacher's doing well, the parents are happy, the principal's happy. Depending on the size of the board or district, if the principals, the students, the parents are happy, the superintendent, the executive superintendent, the director's happy, then the ministry's happy because the community's doing well. So I think what I did differently was everybody else focused at it from a ministry level or a CEO level, and then working its way down to teaching and then learning. And I started with the learning. And as a byproduct, that gave teachers back more time because Edwin was so easy to navigate and understandable and engaging. So sometimes I think ignorance is the best attribute you can have because it's not a barrier it's not a paradigm. You don't have to break it down because you don't know anything. But what I do know is consumerism is the same around the world. Bad hotels go out of business, bad restaurants go out of business, bad product companies don't work. People go to something that works and does what it can do, especially when what it does is more than you actually envisaged it could be, more successful, more engaging, whatever it may be. If you get more than you anticipated, you're even happier. So that was the thesis behind it.
Yeah. And again, as you're speaking, I think about, again, going back to this structure of education that is somewhat insular in the sense that other than perhaps a CIO, maybe a secretary treasurer, pretty much everybody in the education, in an
Yeah.
education district is a teacher. And there's this, I've noticed in some cases, educators are very critical or skeptical of non-educators
Yeah.
coming in and sharing ideas. Right? What do you know about education? At the same time, there's also been a trend to say for people to look outside of education to say maybe schools could be, there used to be like schools could be more like Starbucks, like this community experience,
Yeah.
or how can we learn from the workplace? And so there's an interest, but also a skepticism.
Yeah. There's a
Well,
reticence.
yeah, and I listen as somebody who's calls myself an educator, but has also spent the last 12 years working in on the corporate side of it. I find it so valuable to have outsiders come in and look at something, right? Because you have a fresh set of eyes. You're looking
Yeah.
at it, asking a question that nobody's asked that question because we just assume we're doing a certain thing in a way that's just how we've always done it. And of course, that's why we do it. We know, but you come in as an outsider saying, so I wonder about, you touched on it, but maybe go into a little more detail of what questions were you asking and uncovering in your role, playing the and completely playing the role of, hey, I don't know, I'm not a teacher. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
you're not going to put yourself in a position where you're trying to tell educators what they should be doing.
Yeah.
But what you can do and what you have done, I think, and obviously through this process, is ask questions that made people go, yeah, huh, that is interesting. So
Yeah.
maybe talk about how your curiosity and perception as a non-educator played into your success.
Yeah. I mean, it's twofold. You know, you talk about educators or people in the education industry coming from outside, and the ones I think it's been more difficult because the outsiders who've come, in my experience, from what I've been told historically, haven't really done that well. They said, we're going to change it all and failed and ended up getting out of the marketplace. And to that point, and I'll answer your question totally, Dean, but to the point that you made, the skepticism when people from outside the industry comes, one of the largest school boards in Ontario, one of the largest school boards in Canada, the first time I met with the director, I had a couple of colleagues with me and we get talking and she really wouldn't address me. She was polite and she was nice, but when it came to education, I was the guy who didn't know. I was an outsider. And I actually, when we left that first meeting, I said, next time it'll change. We had a second meeting. It was still the same, talking around me, being polite. But when it came to teaching and learning, she'd talk to my colleagues who'd been lifers in education. And we got in the car, we were leaving the school board headquarters. And I said to my colleagues, you guys have got to take the lead on this one because I'm not resonating. So I'm going to just step out the way. 2 years later, we're in a big meeting with all of her leadership. And by the way, now we're very good friends, very good. Like she sends me a text every Christmas Day. That's how close we've become. It's great. And we sat in this meeting room and one of the superintendents who I'd never met asked me a question and said, wow, interesting journey. What you're doing is really amazing. And I said, thank you for that. I said, I can tell you one thing. I knew I'd changed the company and I really had the self-belief that I'd make a difference. But what I didn't know was I'd fall in love with education. And my relationship with that director changed with one sentence. All of a sudden, her interaction changed to me like, okay, He's one of us now. He just said he loves education. He's okay. He's now no longer an outsider, and the relationship changed. So a lot of that was the building, but the listening part, if you're any kind of a leader, you should spend at least the first year asking and listening and not talking. I did a lot of that. I met with, must have been hundreds, if not 1,000 or more teachers, understanding the classroom dynamic, understanding the pressure on the time, doing all of that, having the exposure to kids in a classroom and asking, would it not be fun if it was like this? Would it? So we were doing that and really understanding their life journey as students and how it differentiated in the classroom and out of the classroom. And I thought, if we can eradicate that the bifurcated nature of their life versus their classroom life and make it more similar, then it's easier for kids. And my view was, learning is a lot like golf or tennis. If you do it once a month, you're not going to be that good at it. But if you do it every single day, you're going to get pretty good at it. So that mastery, I thought, if we can get kids engaged in disciplines and subject and learning across the board, they're going to be better students. And therefore, in golfing terms, their handicap's going to get a lot better. And for teachers, it was about giving them everything they wanted all in one place. Because what I kept hearing is, I've got to be the keeper of 1,000 passwords. I've got to try and manage my class learning on textbooks when I don't even have a full set anymore because they've been damaged. I don't have the budget to top them up. And then what was happening, teachers were spending their own money and going out on things like teacher paid teachers, which is like a landmine because everything in there is not tied to curriculum of the individual province. The nomenclature may be dated and now offensive. So they said, if I had everything, and that's what we tried to create. So it was teacher voice and it was student voice and student interaction. And that's why when we launched Edwin, it wasn't finished. And I've been on record as saying it'll never be finished because it's iterative. But what it was better than anybody had seen before. It was one platform, one single sign-on, all disciplines, as well as many more things like social, emotional, Indigenous learning, history of the Holocaust. So it was a learning environment that was safe and true and tried and tested. And it really is a safe sandbox for learning. And when we look at the hundreds of thousands of kids using it every day, we get the data anonymized, but we see what the users are using. So that then allows us from a product standpoint to say, okay, more of this, less of that. We don't need any of that. That didn't resonate at all. Teacher tools, how they use it. We used to deliver a textbook, would spend $5 to $10 million producing it, take us over 2 or 3 years to align to new curriculum. We'd deliver them to the classroom. We'd never know what chapters were being used, what pages were being used, if it was being used at all, whether it was just gathering dust. But now we get to see. So that gives us a roadmap to our product pipeline to give people what they want. So it was really, it's not unusual in other areas. The sage on the stage, that's history. I kept saying to a lot of the directors, let's write history together, not study it. And the speed of take up on that really depended on the personality of the individual leaders and their ability to say, I'm okay with a bit of discomfort. Let's go through some disruption. And as a result, we've actually seen, this is a literal depiction, Dean. We've seen students leave a board who were used Edwin in grades 6, 7, and 8, but then they didn't use it when they got to grade 9, 10, 11, and 12. So parents going to the leadership saying, my son or daughter didn't used to like school, has used Edwin, their outcomes have gone up, their grade points are going through the roof. They're going to go from grade 8 to grade 9, and you don't use Edwin in grade 9 and in high school. So unless you can continue that learning journey, we're actually going to take our kid out of your school and move them to a board or district that does use grade 9 and 10 and 11. So that's when you realize, I guess we did all right. I guess the journey we went on's what we intended it to be.
You said earlier you fell in love with education. Why?
Everything else I'd done was a job and a great career. And I'd like to think I've made a difference and left a bit of a legacy, but it was commercial or perfunctory. Yeah, better cars for sure. Yeah, was the gaming experience or the viewing experience or the listening experience better than it used to be? For sure. But does it really matter? With education, we're leaving a legacy. And to me, that's what's really important. It's noble work, just like every teacher and every educator, they didn't go into education to make it rich. Goodness only knows every single one of them's underpaid. But if we can shape the GDP of this nation and change countries around the world by what we're doing, the polarization of the extremes of right and left, and I'm not a politician, so I'm not going to get into one or the other, but the polarization is bad for society. And if we can create great leaders for tomorrow, perhaps we can create that as a bit more of a centrist and as a leader who doesn't say there's a right and a wrong, there's just a respected difference. So now I'm like, I'm pretty pleased with what we're doing. And one day I'll be sat on a porch with a nice glass of wine and I'll look back and say, I made a difference, as opposed to I made shareholders wealthy or I made all of our employees get bonuses. That we actually leave a legacy behind that could be measurable.
You articulated it well, but I think any one of us would ascribe to all of those
Yeah.
goals. That's what we're trying to do here. And it gets very granular, obviously, because the day to day is helping that child figure out that math problem or whatever it is. And that seems very minute in this grand scheme of things, but it's all part of, in the end, like if our society is to thrive and to make the differences, this is where it's all going to start. And so, again,
100%.
I think that's well said.
This episode is brought to you by Advanced Learning Partnerships, also known as ALP. We are a professional learning consulting group that serves communities across North America. We are partners, designers, and agents for change. You can learn more about the work we do at alplearn.com. And now back to the show.
So just broadly speaking around leadership, but you mentioned too, you said one of the things that you tried to instill with people is that the risks aren't, this is not life and death. So we'll handle problems as they come. Tell me, if you can be specific, even better, about a leadership challenge that you've had in your career that you look back and think that was a really difficult moment in time, and maybe what you did to overcome that.
At the time, Nelson had two divisions. We had a large post-secondary division, predominantly furnishing undergraduates in every discipline. So whatever course you took in your university or college, we'd be the provider of the textbook. And then the other division was K to 12, which is now our singular focus. And I asked them to give me some data because I don't want opinion or hyperbole. I actually want real data because that's the only thing that really matters. And in the post-secondary environment, at that point, this was 2016, around 50% of students were learning on some kind of digital platform. So if you've got 50% market share, the landscape's already set. I didn't happen to think any of those platforms were any good, which anybody in post-secondary listening to this, I'm sure they're going to continue to despise me for that. But I actually thought that they were counterintuitive to learning. You had to spend more time thinking about how you navigated, which by definition is dilutive to the learning time. Because if you're not thinking about learning, you're thinking about something else, you're being dilutive. And the other thing was either the platforms or the textbooks were way overpriced. So for the 2 years that we operated in that space before I decided to sell that division, we systematically reduced our prices because on average, 50% of students in classrooms weren't buying the textbooks. And then they wondered why their outcomes weren't right when they were just working off the prof's PowerPoint or whatever it may be. And if it came down to a student saying, yeah, I'll buy this new econ book, or I'll go out Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night, in an undergraduate environment, the bar's going to win every time because 50% of the reason kids go to university is that to bridge that gap between adolescence and adulthood. The parents aren't telling them to get the backsides out of bed and get into the lecture hall. They do what they want. Whereas in school at that time in 2016, only 2 or 3% of learning time was in a digital platform. There was a lot of different platforms, but if you actually analyzed the school day across grades K to 12, but particularly 4 to 12, only 2 or 3% of the time was actually on a learning platform, a truly digital platform. So my view, I guess somewhat arrogantly, was if it's only 2 or 3%, if we build this right, we can actually make the landscape, not try and fit into it. And that was the journey that started off with Edwin. We said, we are going to be the landscape, all things to all people. And that was a big step. And I knew if we'd have gone to the marketplace, as I said earlier, that they would have said, we don't really need that. You don't really know what you need if you've never had it. So we knew it had to be better than what was before. And we went through that journey. But then you've got 500 not employees in our office in Toronto. Like, I'll give you it was in another interview I made recently, and the journalist actually led with the line, but I'll avoid the line. Everybody at work thought I was crazy. Like, they were talking to each other like, the new guy doesn't get it. Like, he doesn't understand education. That's not how it works. That's not how it's going to be. So overcoming that and getting the naysayers to cross the field and come onto our side was a big one. And the longer the tenure and the more senior the members of staff, the more difficult it was. And as a result, there's nobody left on my executive team that was there at the beginning because they were more resistant. You talked about education moving slowly. We're an education company. That's all we do. So they may not have been classroom educators, but these are educators. So I'm thinking, all right, if you can't come on the journey, doesn't mean you're a bad person or a poor professional. You were great for the last century, but what's your relevance for the next century? So we started to change and bring people in, and some of them were from education and some of them weren't. But then when you create team, then you can really start to accelerate when everybody shares the vision. So that was probably the biggest challenge. Changing people who were great professionals who'd been doing this job for 30 odd years. And I was the catalyst that they couldn't quite make the change. And one of the advantages and burdens of being the CEO, you don't only get the praise, but you have to take the tough decisions too. So we took the tough decisions. And I will say that the team I've got right now is exemplary. We sing from the same hymn sheet. We march to the same drum. We head in the same direction. We're all going for the same cause. And I know you interviewed Chris Smeaton recently. We work with Chris because I like to surround myself with people who really know the market and test my ideas and my thoughts. When someone like Chris Smeaton, and we've got others, Larry Hope from Ontario, who really believe in what we're doing and actually were part of the journey when we were a partner to his board, but then enjoyed what we did, speaks of it highly, and then loves to work with us because of what we're doing. And it can be chaotic, right? Chaotic is something that frightens some people off, but we move quick. I'll go to a meeting with a superintendent and they'll say, we really would love this. And I'll come back and say to our development team, okay, let's go. Let's do that. You got 3 weeks. And they're like, Steve, our plate's full. I'm like, so eat a bit quicker. Let's find a way of doing it. But slowly that chaos becomes an enjoyable experience, not one that gives you indigestion. So we've changed the DNA. We're a very different company than we used to be.
Yeah, no, and I think when I talk to all leaders, education leaders that have a clear vision of what they want, and it's different for can be a different focus, if you will.
Yeah.
There's that similarity that exists where if you're new to it, that's not how we've done it, and they battle that. So I love that story. So my last question before we just get into the quick wrap up thing is advice for young leaders. And I'm sure you mentor people and people want to know all the time. You talked about your story as a young person at a golf club, thinking about your future and what that would be. What advice would you give to a 25-year-old who said, Steve, I'd love to do something in leadership one day. What do I need to be doing now at this stage to prepare myself for a life in leadership?
It's the mentoring thing, something I'm doing a lot of, from youngsters outside the industry to one guy who was the president of the Students' Union at Western University. I'm still in touch with that guy, Danny. Give him a lot of advice. He's very successful now. But also 4 or 5 directors across the country who are new directors who want to know about leadership. They know about educating. I sit down with them once every couple of months and have dinner and do them. The one piece of advice I give uniformly is you don't have to conform. And if you have enough self-belief and focus and effort, you can create your own reality. Just because it's never been done doesn't mean that it's undoable. So have the commitment, the self-belief, the hard work. You've got to have heart and guts. There is no way around that. You can be educated with 5 master's degrees and a couple of PhDs, but if you don't have heart and guts, you're never going to make a difference. Don't be afraid of falling down. Just get back up. And just because the reality that you want to build's never been built before, with enough effort and heart and guts and doggedness and everything else, you can create your own reality. Think about this. What am I doing? Some would argue successfully, semi-successfully at Nelson with what we're doing in the change. It was just belief that we needed to make a difference, and we could make a difference if we listened, learned, and then acted upon it. So don't give in. You're going to have bad days. It's going to be a bumpy road. If you're committed to what you're doing and where you're going, the variable is going to be the route. If you're absolute in your destination, and that's where I'm going, you'll get there. The route might be a bit circuitous. You may not get there in the way that you thought, but as long as you never, ever dilute the focus on your destination, don't get caught up in the journey. That'll figure itself out. That's the advice I always like to give. It's don't worry about bad days. We all have them. Just be dogged in terms of your focus to get to the point that you set. And that may be career goals, change, living in other countries, learning new languages. If you're absolutely focused on the destination, you can achieve anything.
Great advice too. And I know as part of that, there's always the idea of surrounding, you've been talking about it before, surrounding yourself with good people to help you along the way. It's critical. So one more question before we do the quick wrap up. Gratitude. Part of what I like to do on this podcast is demonstrate and model gratitude. So you get one person, not all the people. You get one person that you want to shout out today as somebody that you are grateful for in education specifically. Who would that be?
Oh, wow. My mind immediately goes to the people I'm going to leave out because it's numerous. If there's one person that I'm grateful for in education, I would say it's the first director who took a risk to launch Edwin as part of a beta. And they actually saw my vision and believed when it looked like it had been built by crayons and stuck together with sticky tape. And it was tremendously successful. That would be the former director of Trillium Lakelands District School Board in Northern Ontario, in the Muskoka area, who I met with at a conference, and I told him my idea. And then a colleague of mine went to meet with Larry and said, okay, Larry, we're going to have a product ready to use in the classroom in September when you come back to school. And he launched with 2 grades, 150 kids. And those 150 kids are now industry professionals. This is 7 years ago. They were grade 8 and 9, I think. And he took a chance and it was a resounding success. But those 150 kids were part of our development team. We like this, we don't like that. We'd love more of this, we don't like that. It would be cool if this button did that and that button did this. So I think it would be Larry Hope because he was courageous enough to take the first step. And now 161 boards and districts across the country have done the same, and it goes up every single day. So I think I'd have to take a salute to Larry.
And I know Larry is an occasional listener, so I'm hoping that he's stayed with us this far and heard his name. It's always nice to hear that, so appreciate that. All right, wrapping up here. Give me a book or something you're listening to that's been challenging you and pushing your thinking a little bit.
Oh, wow. There are 2 books that I always recommend that I'm a ferocious reader. I don't think any of them challenge me. I think that just it gives me the documents, the things that make me ruminate and create thought-provoking. And what about this? How does that translate to a different area? But there are two books that I recommend to people that I think have had the largest effect. One is The Art of War. And a lot of people in business don't see, and I've studied war strategies for years, from historic times to the Second World War, and leadership, Winston Churchill and others, and negative leaders, by the way, including, not that I appreciate what they did or in any way, but looking at it from a leadership standpoint, the horrors of what happened with Al Qaeda and bin Laden and Hitler and everything going back, and the absolute horrors of what not to do with leadership. But The Art of War is one I think people can draw a lot of lessons to learn from leadership, how to think ahead, that next field I was talking about, the psychology of how you overcome problems. And the other one's a book that was published in the 80s called The Machine That Changed the World. And it's really the story of how E.G. Toyoda, the founder of Toyota Motor Company, totally altered his business, the Toyota Motor Company as it now is, and the methodologies for continuous improvement. Never to settle, always to strive for continuous improvement, to get better tomorrow than you were today. And those methodologies transcend any industry. There's always a way. The things like the 5 whys. You don't actually get to the root cause of a problem or an achievement without asking yourself why 5 times, and what is really at a root cause. What made that a success for that child? And not just said because they had a great teacher or engaged parents, but why? Because the teacher really saw themselves in that child. Why? Because they didn't necessarily come from a good home. Why? Because it was a broken home and my safe place was my classroom. Why? Because that was somewhere I felt safe. And at that point, that 5th why, you actually get to the root cause. So The Machine That Changed the World, I literally buy cases of both of those books and I give them out to people and say, read both of these. Forget what the industry is, or forget what the nature is, whether it's a battle to make a school better or a battle to take a continent. It's a battle. And you have to
Well, I
battle
think,
every day.
and I love that because I think good learners can extrapolate a lot of things. They don't have to have everything perfectly aligned to to be able to realize the lessons they learned. And that's what learning is. So that's powerful. What about from a pure entertainment? I can't just think and go hard all day long. What do you consume, whether it's a binge watch or something like that? I'm always curious to find out, like, yeah, I can't be serious all the time. Sometimes I just need to get away and watch or consume something that's less intellectual, if you will. So what's the lighter side of Steve Brown?
It depends who I'm with, right? My daughter is a very successful young woman. She's 26. She's a trader at CIBC. She comes and stays with me often at the weekend. She loves to watch comedies, and Bridesmaids is one of her favorites. So I've probably seen that 8 times when we can't find anything else. So a bit of potty humor in there, but
Sure.
it's pretty funny. But my viewing and reading and listening's very eclectic. I listen to everything from Vivaldi to Eminem. And again, it's that right and wrong. I love the Churchill movie that was made with Gary Oldman. I thought that was a great depiction of an extremely difficult period in time. I'm an avid football fan, soccer, big Liverpool fan. So every weekend I'm watching Liverpool. We had a terrible weekend this weekend. Could have just cost us the Premiership, but I'm actually taking both my kids over to watch a game in England, May 4th, May 5th, Liverpool game, one of the last games of the season. So my escapism's probably in sport and probably in soccer, watching Liverpool.
Nice, nice. Okay, last question. You're a world traveler. You've lived in a lot of different places. You travel a lot, but let's focus on your home now, Toronto.
Yeah.
And somebody that's coming to visit, you can Google it. You'll see CN Tower. You'll see all the things that
Yeah.
normally people see. But I want you to give me some place that might not be on that first or second page, but you should check this place out. It could be a restaurant. It could be a park. It could be whatever, just a place that people say, when you come to Toronto, don't forget and go here. You'll enjoy it. So what's that hidden gem?
I always think about Toronto as a series of small villages that just got squashed together and made a city. I think the eclectic nature of Toronto is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. You talk about a melting pot with 110 languages, but you can travel 3 kilometers and it looked like a different world. So, I take them from the area I live on the East End, or I'll take them up to Yorkville. So you've got luxury stores or you've got eclectic restaurants. So I like to show them around and see the city. But I think a lot of people who visit just don't realize how beautiful it is down by the waterfront as well. So I like to demonstrate the difference, not just one place. Whether you're in Cabbagetown or Yorkville or you're over on the West End at College and Ossington, all of the different cultures and languages. You've only got to walk down any street in Toronto, and I think it is one of the greatest cities in the world. I've been fortunate enough to live in many places, in some beautiful cities, fabulous parts of the world, southern France, idyllic. But if you were to ask me today, my favorite city in the world, I'd tell you it's home. It's Toronto.
Nice. Yeah. Hey, my son still lives there. My daughter lived there. Lived in Chinatown for a while in different places. So yeah, I have to agree. It is a really great city. It's clean.
Yeah.
It's safe. Lots of good things. So anyway, hey Steve, thank you so much for your time today. This was enlightening. Just great to hear about your journey and in leadership. And again, I think there's so much that we all learn from each other, and you're just another one of the great Canadian education leaders. So thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure, Dean. It's a very cathartic exercise to go through all of that history. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.
Cheers, bud.